So I'm guessing we're live now. Should we wait for a few more? I'll give it 20 seconds until 11:30 and 1 minute, and then we'll get started. So I've just been told we're live, so we may as well crack on. Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending this session on social value. I have not done this before, so this is going to be interesting, but I'm going to try to keep everything on time, try and do all of the appropriate housekeeping. So any questions you have, keep them coming into the Q&A section, and we'll try to answer them as we go through. But do get involved, as they say. A couple of things on housekeeping. 1 p.m. is the awards, which is probably why you're all here. This is just a very interesting diversion and thought-provoking session. And then at 3 p.m. there's another talk on the race to net zero. So we'll do, without further ado, we'll do quick intros. My name's Will Watt. I'm director of State of Life, and we measure and monetize social value. So I'll let the speakers introduce themselves. It'll be Samantha, Jeremy, then Jenny. Over to you, Samantha.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name's Samantha Freelove. I am Tideway's Legacy and Sustainability Lead. I've worked in the sustainability space in the built environment, infrastructure and buildings for near on 20 years now. So I have history in seeing sustainability evolve from the margins into the center of business. So it's a really exciting time to be working in this space. And I'll be talking a bit later on about my work on Tideway and social value.
Hi, my name's Jeremy Galpin. I've been working with Samantha on the Tideway project as the legacy lead for the East section with the Costain Vinci Bashi joint venture. I now lead Costain's digital social value consultancy capability. So excited to talk to you today about how digital can help us maximize good for our communities and society as a whole.
Morning, everybody. My name's Jenny Shepherd from Canal and River Trust. For those who are not familiar with the Canal and River Trust, we're the charity that looks after about 2,000 miles of inland waterways that run through many of our towns and cities of England and Wales. And they encompass 200 years of industrial history and priceless cultural assets, including a couple of World Heritage sites and many, many beautiful listed buildings. And my role as research and impact manager is to secure robust evidence of the impact and outcomes of our work on the inland waterways. So I should be giving just one example a little bit later on.
Thank you. Very well done, everybody. So we'll do a couple of quick polls to get you started. First one is, do you attach monetary value to your social value? So there's one of the disciplines is you can measure social value and what's been going on, but do people put pound signs to it? So if you can just quickly answer those, that would be good. We'll see where we get to. Most people is a yes. No, and we don't know how to. Quite a few. And no, but we're about to start is 2. So most people do. Okay, that's good. So the next question we'll ask is, and this is the one I'm going to be interested in looking at. Do you know what the Green Book is? Yes, no, sort of. Because we will talk about that later. And this is a question of, do we need to explain it a little bit more? Most people know. Okay, that's good. Okay, well, we'll go through it. I'm going to talk for a little while. I'll just talk very briefly, actually, on social value and probably a little bit of the definition of it, because one of the things one of the reasons for asking that Green Book question is that it very clearly does define what social value is. And I've been working in the area probably 10 years, and we started out measuring it for a volunteering charity. I'd worked out, my background was fairly commercial, and I'd worked out that we were recruiting volunteers for £80. And I said to all the great and good that were on our board, and I'm not going to name any names here because that will get me in trouble, but I said to everybody on the board, is £80 a good figure? What are volunteers worth? And I was met with a mixture of horror that I was even suggesting we measure the value of volunteering because it's a free gift from the heart. Skepticism by people from accountancy firms going, oh no, I think you're talking about social return on investment. That's just a load of nonsense. And then as we started to look at it, I was just met with confusion because there seemed to be so many terms, definitions, people arguing with each other about what it should be called, different methodologies and each person thought that theirs was better than the others. And it was incredibly confusing. And we were really lucky, and it was genuinely luck. We were watching Newsnight one night, or I was, and saw a chap called Lord Gus O'Donnell. And he was a government economist and at the time and just retired, had just moved on from being chief cabinet secretary and head of the civil service. And he was talking about the well-being economics. And back in 2011, that was described as experimental and interesting. But now, and we'll talk about this a bit later, but now it's much more the key objective of all policy. And this is all written down in what's called the Green Book. And the Green Book, and most of you didn't know what that was, which is probably makes this bit of it useful rather than teaching you to suck eggs. But the Green Book is the Treasury, Her Majesty's Treasury's guidance on how you evaluate and appraise economically in the value of projects and policy. And it's very much, it's considered, the vernacular is it's the Bible. And if you're using Green Book methodologies, it's considered the sort of gold standard. So I'm just going to put on screen now. I hope you can all see this, but I'm going to read it anyway. If you can't, if I've got this wrong, I'll probably get a message saying you've got it wrong. But this is the definition of social value in the 2018 Green Book. So economic appraisal is based on the principles of welfare economics. That is how the government can improve social welfare or well-being, referred to in the Green Book as social value. So what's changed really since 2011, and we'll talk more about this later, is that well-being and overall sort of satisfaction of people's lives or welfare has become pretty much the guiding principle of how we evaluate everything, policy, projects. And there's been new guidance in July this year that we'll talk about later. It's quite important that because over the years, I personally always felt like there was a whiff of smoke and mirrors in social value where everyone was talking about different things. Sometimes it was self-serving because they had one particular method that they wanted to propagate and get out there and perhaps had commercial interest behind it. Whereas what has happened now is that it's all very clear and it's all incredibly open and transparent and pretty much available to everybody. So that becomes really interesting. But I'm not going to go on too much about that now. I'm going to hand over to Samantha, and then it'll be Jeremy and then Jenny, just to talk about their experiences. And I'll come back later to talk about the latest guidance on all of this. So over to you, Samantha.
Okay, thank you, Will. Thanks for that great intro to the session. I want to kick off by stating that last year Tideway was really proud to be recognised by the Global Good Awards and the judges as the Company of the Year. The judges recognise that as much as we're an environmental project whose endpoint is improving water quality and reduction of sewage discharged into the River Thames, they recognise that it's how we're delivering the project that really they awarded us Business of the Year. And this external recognition is really important to us. So we were very proud this time last year, and good luck to everybody that's up for awards this afternoon. So Tideway, if anyone of you don't know, which is highly likely, we're one of the biggest infrastructure projects currently happening in Europe. We're tagged the Super Sewer. So we're a 25-kilometre long tunnel running from west to east underneath the River Thames. And as Jeremy mentioned, he's part of the JV in the east section. We've also got joint ventures in the west and the central sections. So we're running from Acton and West London right the way through central London, so past the Houses of Parliaments and all those great landmarks in London, and then out to the east, where the tunnel will connect with the Lee Tunnel, which is currently up and operational, and part of the wider London Tideway improvement schemes, whose aim is to reduce sewage overflows into the River Thames, leaving a cleaner river, a reduction in sewage-derived litter. You'd be surprised what people put down their toilets and what ends up in the river and on the foreshores. So thereby leaving a cleaner river for river users, but also for the ecology of the River Thames. But what we're classing a mature project at the moment. We got a development consent order about 10 years ago, and we're currently 70% through construction. But we like to think that we have had a positive impact on the communities in which we work. 10 years ago, the world was a very different space in terms of social value, in terms of environmental impact. And we've had time recently to reflect on what that means to us. So we feel that, the ethos of Tideway is to be a responsible business, but the nature of construction is we do have some impacts. We do annoy our local communities. We do have an environmental and carbon footprint, but we have tried really hard to mitigate that impact. One way that we've trying to mitigate it is we looked at the core benefits of the Thames Tideway Tunnel, which was set out by DEFRA within the business plan. And those core benefits, we thought, well, that's great, but we have a real opportunity as a major piece of infrastructure to create wider benefits for London and for those communities within those 14 London boroughs in which we are operational. So we set up our legacy programme, which consists of 54 legacy commitments across 5 themes of environment, health, safety, well-being, people, economy, and place. And the aim was to do something bigger and better and wider than just construct the tunnel and leave something very positive in operation. But 10 years after the development of the legacy programme, we're starting to complete some of those legacy commitments, say that we've already achieved them. And we've obviously had a number of years in order to get all the data in from our main works contractors and understand what we've done well, what we would have done differently if we have our time again, and therefore the learning that we feel we can pass on to future infrastructure projects or built environment projects. So what has Tideway done around social value? Social value is a tool that we have used since 2014 on Tideway. Sorry, just saw something go. Since 2014 on Tideway, we used the social return on investment method. We felt that that was a tool that suited us, and we used it first of all to assess the social value of our skills and employment programme. And this was really used as an indication by our consultants then to test whether the metrics that we were using would create meaningful, impactful social impact around the employment and upskilling space. This was then followed on by a further SROI in 2018, and we are now working with State of Life on our final social value assessment, which will take us up to substantial completion of our works in 2022. But I will say, back from 2014 to now, and also working with State of Life, they have challenged us on the traditional notion of social value. It is wider than what we originally thought, and a lot less traditional too. So traditionally, we were capturing our STEM volunteering hours, our community engagement hours, number of people involved, number of jobs created, which is all really great. But Tideway and our legacy programme has also set up some more qualitative commitments, which aren't so easily tied to Green Book metrics and not quite so easy to monetize, because we do monetize as well. So we are now using a mixed method approach. So we're using some quantitative analysis whereby we assess that against traditional metrics to uncover the value created, but also qualitative metrics, the qualitative analysis is really around those programs that Tideway has set up, for example, to create a more diverse and inclusive workplace. investment in our immersive health and safety induction program, our innovation program, and our desire to reconnect London with the River Thames. So that reconnect London with the River Thames is in fact a legacy commitment. How do you measure the impact of that? What does that mean? You know, it's a commitment that we're very proud of, but we've really had to think quite hard about how you distill that down into impact and measurement. So it's these non-traditional interventions that Tideway has done that we are now assessing the state of life through qualitative interviews and workshops with key stakeholders. And they will be coming out findings of that will be coming out over the next 12 months. So one of the challenges and recent shifts in our mindset is that social value is linked to the wider economy. We've invested a lot in innovations within our sector. We had a big innovation program. One of those innovations in particular is around how we decarbonize our carbon footprint. We've got a big carbon footprint during construction associated with the concrete that we are using. We're a very passive asset in operation with low emissions. But what do we do about this carbon footprint that we have in construction? And so we've invested in R&D and research, and done a lot of ideas have come forward from our main works contractors. And that's something that we didn't really think fitted into the traditional concept of social value. And that is what has been challenged. And that is where we're uncovering the value to business and the value to our sector, particularly in the transition to net zero. And I'm really interested to hear this afternoon's webinar as well around this topic, and how those innovations and that investment actually does have a value for the wider UK PLC in achieving their net zero ambitions as much as our business as well. So we are reflecting back. So we're not looking internally, we are reflecting back on how Tideway has been particularly beneficial to the external sector. And then just, you know, reflecting on the infrastructure sector as a whole, there has been some challenges that the infrastructure sector isn't doing enough around the social value play space, and the Institute of Civil Engineers did some recent research on that, around how infrastructure sector has an opportunity and an obligation really to embed social value into their activities. And it has been recognised that in the procurement and construction of the assets, social value opportunities should be created that respond to the needs of that project location. But often infrastructure projects is quite hard, they're quite widespread. The impacts are wider than what you would anticipate. And also you have to make sure on setting up your programme that ideally these impacts and what you want to measure and the value that you want to create is set within a framework that is easy and more prescriptive in terms of how you're going to measure that. So some key things that we have learnt on Tideway over the last decade, or particularly I think over the last few years, is really when the conversations around social value, the conversations around infrastructure projects and building projects and the net zero space as well has really become a lot more articulate than even 5-10 years ago. So I don't want to criticize Tideway, because I think at the time we set out to do what we felt was the best to do. And one of those things that we've always done and has been used beneficially within our business is to monetize social value. We haven't used it to replace the story. We still want the narrative behind the impact that we've created, but we have felt that putting a monetary value against particular commitments has helped internally and externally to stakeholders to communicate what we feel the value of our legacy programme is.
You've got 30 seconds, Samantha.
30 seconds.
The alarm has just gone off.
But on the flip side, I would say we did set one example of where a metric was particularly challenging, was working with people with convictions. We had a quantitative target around that. It didn't work. Our main works contractors were doing an awful lot of outreach work with charity partners and people within the prison service on interview skills and CV writing skills, but it was never being being achieved. So we commissioned a social value assessment on what we were doing, and that social value assessment unpicked it all and understood that actually our interventions were being positive, even though when you measure it just against a quantitative target, it felt like we were doing nothing for this hard to reach group. And I will actually...
You're finished.
I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. Okay, well, we'll crack on in no short order. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Will. And I think we're going to have a poll coming up about the use of digital technology. Is it critical to maximising social value outcomes? So if that poll comes up shortly, if you could respond to that, that would be great. I'm going to talk a bit about how digital technology can help us maximise social value. And I'm first going to talk a bit about the work we've done on Tideway with Samantha, and particularly around the volunteering activity we've done in the local community, and the difference that's made, and how actually what we've done, as Samantha has said, was not right up to speed in terms of best practice, what currently is done. So how we actually need to improve that approach and move from an outputs-based measure to an outcomes-based measure. Then I'm going to talk briefly about our experience of responding to something called PPN 0620, which is some government legislation that was recently coming out around social value and supporting the Green Book that Will was talking about. And finally, I'm going to talk about how we've been working with customers to look at their investment decisions around capital using the 4 capitals model, and picking up on what Samantha was talking about the breadth of value that infrastructure projects can add, and how that can be helpful, and how digital can help us with that big conversation. So thank you for your responses. I think we've got majority of people in agree, some strongly agree somewhat, and 1 disagree. So thank you for that, and we're going to actually repeat that poll at the end. So in terms of our volunteering activity, so someone talked about the benefit of sport in the chat. We partnered with an organisation called London Youth Rowing, and I'm going rowing in the Olympic Park this afternoon, to work with young people and use rowing and sport to improve their employability skills. And this is part of a volunteering programme, and the main focus was around a number of hours. That was the KPI that we had to achieve, that we committed to at tender stage and throughout the project, and that we were dashboarded against. And we did some really interesting work as we progressed through the project, looking at the impact of our work with the young people. But if you take our STEM volunteering as an example, we didn't really ask that question of the beneficiaries. What difference have we made in your life? And Will talked about this definition from the Green Book about the well-being, happiness, economics. So ultimately, it's about what difference did we make in those young people's lives? And that's where we need to get to on future projects, to go away from what is inefficient, which is a numbers of hours volunteering target, to a outcome-based target, which is what difference did we make? And if we can do it with less time at a lower price and bigger difference, that's even better. So how does that relate to technology? Well, what we're looking to do on future programs is basically use a survey tool, but obviously a secure one, a robust one. And it needs us to do long-term assessment of the impact of our volunteering. It needs to be more focused, understand who the beneficiaries are, and keep asking the questions. And that data can help improve our volunteering. It can help us make it more efficient. And most importantly, it can help us ensure that we're actually delivering good for the local communities that we're working for. So that's an example from the Tideway project, which has been absolutely fantastic to work on, and a real privilege, an example of what an infrastructure can do in terms of legacy. So Will talked about the updated Green Book and how that's really helpful in defining social value. The government also launched early this year something called PPN 0620, and this requires all procurement that's using government money to have a 10% of the scoring of the bid to be based on the social value that's going to be delivered on that project. So, for example, complex projects like Stonehenge or future Crossrail jobs, 10% of the assessment of the tender has to be around social value. And that's 10% has to be what you're going to do over and above the delivery of the commission. So in the case of the Tideway Tunnel, we could have built the tunnel without employing apprentices, but we employed lots of local apprentices from a very diverse background, and that was a added social value. So it's 10% on what you're going to do over and above the commission. So this is a huge shift, but it is still limited. And to explain how it's limited, I'm going to talk about one of the themes on the framework. So one of the themes is about community cohesion. And so we can be asked as a bidder to say how we're going to address community cohesion in terms of delivering the project. Now, what's interesting is if you then look at the metric or the data point that's been collected against community cohesion, that is volunteering hours. So hopefully you can see the link with my first point, that you can't actually measure community cohesion by the number of volunteering hours. It's much, much more complex than that. So we, again, need to move beyond that. We need to innovate, and we use the technology to understand the current level of community cohesion in the local area, what impact we're having, and what's happening long term. So the PPN is great. It's a big shift, but there's still work to do in terms of innovate and get to where we need to be. And finally, I want to talk about the big capital investment decisions we make as a country and as a nation. So we're working with customers to look at their capital investment decisions, and we're using the 4 capitals model of the Global Capital Coalition. And these 4 capitals are production, which is your traditional economic value, natural capital, and social and human capital. The social and human being traditionally where social value has been positioned. And what we're doing is talking to customers about what outcomes they want to achieve across those 4 capitals. And we're using something called the Values Toolkit to help with those conversations and identify around those 4 capitals the outcomes in each of the areas. So it's a paradigm shift in terms of the approach to investing in infrastructure in this country. Instead of saying what is the most economic advantageous tender, what is the economic benefits we want from this investment, we're looking at all those 4 capitals, designing outcomes around the 4, and then deciding what we want to build or not build. Now, if we're going to do that, we have to collect data around all those 4 capitals. And we have to collect data not only during the build phase, as Tideway is in currently, but through the whole life cycle of the project. And by doing that, we can then decide whether we've achieved what we set out to do, whether we've achieved the outcomes we set out to do. So how are we going to do that? Well, the only way we can do that is using digital tools. And there's a concept called a digital twin, where you basically have a digital version of the asset. And that's traditionally been seen as a way of operating and maintaining your asset and running tests and trials. Data gets exchanged between the physical asset and the digital asset. And what we're exploring with our customers, for example, Anglian Water, is how do you put in data around social capital, human capital, and natural capital? And how do you collect that data within that digital twin, model it, visualize it, let your stakeholders see it so that they can understand what you're doing, whether you're achieving and whether you're delivering on your promises. So I hope you find that helpful. Could we have the poll again in terms of do we agree that digital technology is critical to maximizing social value outcomes? We're going to try and see if we can have that again. And it may be that has your opinion changed? That's the question based on what I've said. If we go on to more people disagreeing, then I've gone backwards with my presentation. So how are we doing?
Well done on time.
I think we're a bit stronger, a little bit higher. I think I've had some impact. Good. All right. Well, that's me, Will. Thank you very much.
Perfectly on time there, Jeremy. That was very good. By the way, to people who are putting questions, I'm keeping a log of the questions, and we are going to answer them later. There's for John and Phil. I've got plenty to say on both of those. So we'll come to those at the end. But without further ado, we're going to shift over to Jenny from Canal and River Trust and to talk about her experience of social value.
Thank you very much. Well, our experience, and there's some resonance with other speakers, because I'm also going to talk about how we valued our volunteering, a value to the trust, but beyond that as well, value to the individual and also to the wider society. I'm going to talk a little bit more technical about methodology and some key findings, which hopefully you'll find interesting. So, as Will mentioned earlier, whilst anecdotal evidence and accepted wisdom supports the premise that volunteering is good for individuals and organisations alike, our project wanted to prove this empirically through government-approved, robust, nationally validated measures of well-being, and, if possible, a meaningful economic valuation. And that's where the Green Book methods come in. We're bound to follow those as a charity. The Trust works with many wonderful volunteers. They enjoy their roles, and to be honest, I'm not sure we could do all the fantastic work we do without their help. The question, therefore, is how we can best assess the social value of this resource and its value, like I said earlier, to the Trust, the individual and wider society. So to do this, from a methodological point of view, we adopted a mixed methods, and Samantha was mentioning earlier how, you can measure outputs, quantitative things, numbers of things, but also we want to find out more about the qualitative side of things, the outcomes, so more of the benefits. So we conducted surveys with our research partner, interviewed volunteers to get their views on what they valued about their experience as volunteers, and most importantly, arguably, we cross-referenced our findings with statistical information about existing research and comparison with large national data sets, so we could compare our volunteer outcomes with others. So that was basically how we did it. And here are a few of the key findings, which I'll see what you think of them. So formal volunteering, I mean, we could get into a discussion about different types of volunteering, but so as part of a group, as people do at the Trust, is up to 4 times more significant in improving well-being. So that's an interesting one. The Canal and River Trust volunteers display higher personal well-being than the general sample of a similar age of population. So that's important. Obviously you need to compare like with like. So comparing similar demographics for people who do volunteer and who don't. There's higher personal well-being in those who do volunteer. And interestingly, Canal and River Trust volunteers have very similar and at times marginally higher well-being scores than volunteers in other sectors. So that was good to know as well. In terms of how much work our volunteers do, and this might surprise you, they are twice as likely to volunteer weekly than the general national comparison. They work very, very hard. Our volunteers can work as much as 3.6 hours a week. Sorry, 3.4 hours a week compared to 3 hours a week for your average volunteer. So that's quite a commitment, 3 hours every week. I was impressed with that. And also the well-being increases with frequency of volunteering. So the more it's like a dose effect, I suppose, up to a certain extent. Obviously, we can't expect them to be working 24 hours a day for us. That would be ridiculous. And it wouldn't be good for them at all. It wouldn't be bad for your well-being. Volunteering is good for society too, as it underpins the provision and delivery of many services, as Julian said in his comments earlier, if you've been able to read those. So contribute to all of our quality of life. So, for example, on the inland waterways, our volunteers help preserve the natural environment, our priceless heritage, and the cultural heritage too. So we're all benefiting. So it is possible to assign an economic value. For example, for well-being, there's a standard measure, which Will, I think, might mention in a second, which can value the improvement based on an improved quality of life. And we found that 1/3 of the total value is due to increased personal well-being of the volunteers themselves. And then the other 2/3 is due to benefits to the organisation and to the wider society. So that's basically what we did, and we were very interested and delighted with the results, and it's great to be able to demonstrate not just anecdotally but empirically how valuable volunteering is to the trust. But I would just like to run a little poll now to ask the question, do you believe that the main outcome of social value should be well-being? And see what you think.
Apologies, I'm just going to find it. Oh, it's got magic.
Hey, it's popped up. So happy to answer any questions. I've been more expedient or in my little session. So
that's fine. We'll get at least more questions for the end, Jenny. So that's all good. Well done.
No problem. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, we kept a little log of the questions. And my job now, I'll just talk a little bit about, and I'll try and do this in a way that addresses some of the questions that have come in, actually. So I was going to do another poll, and I'm quite interested to see this one, but let's see what everyone says to this. Do you believe what you read in social value reports? Just yes, mostly, or no? Just to sort of see what people think about the veracity of the whole area. So no one has put yes. The majority are mostly. That's probably right, actually. That's probably right. That's probably right. The reason for putting that down is I think that one of the areas that we've talked about, I mean, Jeremy talked about social cohesion. One of the thing that we heard Gus O'Donnell talking about was one of the most important commodities in an economy is trust. Do we trust one another? Volunteering is incredibly good for trust because it reinforces reciprocity, which is we will do things to help one another, so we trust one another. And trust is important because it reduces what's called transaction costs, i.e. if broadly speaking in this country we all think everyone else is okay, we'll be quicker to do business, we'll be quicker to get things done. So these are the sorts of social outcomes that you can measure on top of life satisfaction. So we'll talk a little bit about that now, because I'll just talk through, broadly speaking, how we approach this, and it will cover a few things that have come up in the conversation. So in all of the sort of, and it was confusion that I was experiencing and we were experiencing early on, we tried to boil down the whole process to 3 steps that seemed to be relatively simple for people to get their head around. There's lots of talk about inputs, outputs, all that sort of language. And really what you want to talk about is outcomes. So I think it was Dave who put a question on, how would you measure the value of Gareth Southgate? Well, what is the outcome you think Gareth Southgate's impact on the culture of this country is? It might be trust, it might be, but you've got to boil it down to not just throwing things up to say, well, this is good, let's measure this. You've got to be really clear about what it is that you think the outcome is. What is that? Now, when it comes to well-being, broadly speaking, it boils down to there's the 4 ONS questions of what makes life worth living, and they're broadly all boil down to how satisfied are you with your life out of 10. And there's all sorts of things that drive that. There's happiness, there's anxiety, there's do you think what you do is worthwhile? So that would be things like, do you think your job and your lifestyle is worthwhile? And then underneath that, there's all sorts of other drivers that we know about. There's a slight myth that well-being is this soft thing on the outside that's all about how you feel. But really, we can dig into all sorts of data that says, obviously, having a home, having a job are really, really important. So it's not just measuring fluffy things. And that's been the transformation, really, of the last 10 years. What the Treasury and everybody is recognizing that is the utility, that's the economic term in some ways, the utility of all the things that make up our life. What are the things that drive life satisfaction the most? What are the most important? Now, that's the bit that I think starts to get really interesting. So what are those primary drivers? We'll talk about those in a minute later on. So once you've defined your outcomes, you then have to track whether it was actually you that caused them. So a good example here is sport. For years, sport has reported things like going for a swim every week reduces heart disease. Now, there's an issue of causation there, which is that people who have got a heart condition tend not to be at the swimming pool to be surveyed about whether they go swimming every week. So it's probably that the people swimming are already healthier. And the other thing that goes on in something like sport is the people that do sport and are fitter are, broadly speaking, much more higher socioeconomic demographics. Now, one of the biggest drivers of your health, one of the biggest drivers of life satisfaction is your health. And one of the biggest drivers of health is your socioeconomics. So what you start to begin to piece together is what are the key drivers of social value and life satisfaction within the population. So you've got to then, that's where impact on causation comes in. You've got to be able to compare the rowers that the Tideway group worked with a group of people who haven't experienced that. And they've got to be matched. They've got to be the same demographics. They've got to be the same age, because all of these things contribute to well-being. So that's where the second step comes in. Did you and your project actually cause this? And this is the step that's the most difficult. And it's a step that is very tempting to miss out. And you say, we've had 100 rowers come to our club. Rowing's brilliant for you, so we're worth X million. What you haven't done is really establish that it was the rowing and not the fact that rowers are from very good schools and tend to become from higher socioeconomic groups that means they had already a very high life satisfaction score. And it's that second step that's really difficult. And that's where recently there's been the bottom right of that slide is the 2021 wellbeing guidance from the Treasury on how you measure well-being. And it's a real, we're doing a talk on Friday on this, it's a mini revolution because it spells out exactly how you do it. If you're interested in this area, please go and read it. It's a really good read. It was a DEFRA economist, Sarah McClellan, and she's done an absolutely brilliant job pulling together all the massive egos and economists and universities, and she's done an absolutely wonderful job of digesting the science, and then how you measure and apply it. We were celebrating like we'd won a Olympic gold medal because really it's what we launched a couple of years ago. Jeremy talked about survey questions. We just use survey questions from existing data sets so that you can immediately compare your rowers to people in Sport England's active live data set. So you can start to do these comparisons that are essential to that second step. And it's only when you've done that second step that you start to attach values to this and say, this is worth X. Volunteering is about £2,000 a year is the truth of it. It's about what it's worth in well-being terms. You can then start to attach monetary values to it. And again, this is where the 2021 Green Book guidance is incredibly useful because it's unveiled this new measure called the well-be, which is a value of a 1 point increase in your life satisfaction. So think about the answer now. We could have put this one up. How satisfied are you with your life nowadays out of 10? Have a little think. It's probably going to be around 7 because that's what most people in the country are. But an increase of 1 is worth £13,000. So if you can demonstrate that your project's increased, and that's a lot, that's a big lift. Not many things do that. And then you've got this value called the well-being, which is really interesting because it's also benchmarked to something called the QALY, which is how the NHS puts an economic value on whether a drug is cost effective or whether a certain intervention is cost effective. So all of this starts to join up to become really credible, robust, and usable practically. So, and the final point really, there was a comment, and somebody put in something about climate change and sports kit. And I think one of the things that I used to work in is climate change. And we did something way back then when I was at the BBC, which was there's always a list of like 40, 50 things you can do to be green, do to save CO2. And there's all sorts of lists of things you can do to generate social value. The question becomes, well, how do I pick what the top 3 are? So how do I prioritize? And that's the question that you can start to get to. And in about a month's time, we're going to do a Wellbe guide of values to say, look, if you've got a project, these are the top 3 things that will have value. This other idea you've got, it's not harmful, but it's probably not worth the effort you're going to put into it. And it's much the same in climate change. And I disagree with the sports kit one. When you measure carbon dioxide, there's 3 things that you just have to deal with, and they're massive, and it's not sports kit. But we can deal with that in the questions. So that's what we do, really. And I was just going to show one thing that I think is helpful if you're doing this. We did a study on churches, and I think everybody's talked about the way value radiates out from the project. So if you help people, they volunteer. Those volunteers then run a service. And this is a study we did for the social and economic value of churches. And churches there's more food banks than McDonald's in this country, and 100% of them are run by churches. So whatever you think of God and the church, you just have to there's a congregation, there's a value to that. It is good for you going to church, but then they run food banks, they run after school care, they run coffee mornings, they're running mental health services, drug and alcohol support. And the circles of value radiate out. And we find this quite a helpful image, really, and a way to look at social value is measure the things, and then the circles of value radiate out. And in truth, the values towards the outer side, you could admit, become less and less robust. But I'm going to stop now, and we're doing quite well on time. We've got 10 minutes for questions, 15 minutes for questions, which is more or less spot on. So if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat or ask them now. I'd quite like to hear about. So John Broadfoot, recycling sports kit is so much more than CO2 savings. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that when you prioritize these things by an order of magnitude for climate change or for well-being, there's certain things that are more important than others. So Gus O'Donnell, when I first met him, he said to me, he said, well, what do you think the most important thing you can do for the economy is? And I said, because I'm from the north, I went, restore manufacturing to the northwest and the northeast. He went, absolutely not, nowhere near. And the answer was mental health. Mental health is the biggest negative impact on the economy over anything else. So what we've got to try to get to is, it's not that anyone's doing any harm, but we just have to try to focus on the things that really do make a difference. And the order of magnitude can be quite enormous between something that sounds good to something that's actually doing good. Another economist who invented the Wellbe, Paul Freiters, an incredibly charismatic LSE professor, his answer to this question of what's the most important thing for the economy is free marriage guidance counselling, which is quite, I was like, right, really? And that's because having a strong, supportive life partner is important and really, really good for your well-being. So his answer was teach good relationships into schools so that we know how to form strong, trusting relationships. So these are the things that later in the month we're going to put together a Wellbe value guide that will give people who are starting a social value project, look, here's where it's worth putting the effort, and here it's not that it's bad, it's just not worth quite as much. I'm trying to see if there's any other questions. Hang on, they might have gone into the chat. Oh, Julian's added, who wrote that. Honestly, the Green Book Wellbeing Guidance is really, really worth a read. I know that might sound like the dullest thing anyone could ever suggest to you, but it is really good.
Will, do you want me to try and respond to the trade-off issue which you've dealt with?
Yes, please do. Go on, Jeremy.
Yeah. So the question from Phil was, how do you decide on the trade-offs between different beneficiaries' impact areas, either social value added by, say, using apprentices versus the negative environmental impacts of a certain development? I think, Phil, you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the challenge of these trade-offs. And if you look at the very strategic level that I talked about, the 4 capitals model, what we're saying, looking at with customers is, okay, what are the priorities around these 4 capitals? And what are the priorities driven by? Is it national policy? Is it regulator? Is it your local stakeholders? And then the difficult bit is making the decisions about what you spend money on. And you're absolutely right. That's the way you've got to do, and you've got to do it with some rigor. And going back to the point that Will was making about what makes the biggest impact and what your focus is. So if it's, for example, a water cleansing plant, the main purpose of the plant is to deliver clean water for the stakeholders. So that is going to be a natural capital outcome, and that's going to be the main focus, and that's the main area your budget will be focused on. So it is about this process of prioritization and deciding what is important based on all these different drivers that are part of the conversation. Hope that helps.
That's good. It is about, I mean, it's a bit like, it's very analogous, this area, to climate change, in that it was quite confusing, lots of conflicting information, and lots of people feel passionately that what they're doing and they're working on is ultimately the most valuable. And you do sometimes need a little bit of science to come in and say, actually, this is where the values are. This is all of it put together, and it does help. It's not a criticism of anyone. It's just a sort of any nascent area. I mean, even climate change is relatively new. It's less than 50 years old. It's quite a new science, a lot of it. So it is important to prioritize and not be too hung up on hanging on to your thing when maybe the science doesn't agree with it. It always affects your ego quite a lot when somebody proves you're rather wrong, which has happened to us quite a lot. So we're good at that. We've got to do takeaways. Does anyone have anything that they? I think I've tried to do most of the questions.
There's one at the end from Gori about what do you think of social value and well-being in developing countries? Yeah,
that's the oh gosh, that would be, we've just done a study. I don't want to brag about too much of our stuff, but we have just done a study about volunteer midwives in Togo and the economic value that they have, which was absolutely fascinating. There's all sorts of interesting models around that. We did a study for the methodology that we have for valuing volunteering was picked up by the UN for exactly that purpose, and trying to generate volunteering all over the world and how you track the impact. But it's quite, so we are going to be doing another project actually, but it's very complicated. There are sort of similar measures that the UK uses that are used across the world as well. So well-being is becoming much more common. I'm conscious of time. Does anyone have any key things or any more questions or takeaways from our speakers from today of what they might have learned and picked up? I'm going to start with you, Jeremy, and then I'm going to go to Samantha, and then I'm going to go to Jenny.
So my takeaway for everyone is think digital. How can you use digital tools to maximize your impact? And if I can give one example linked to Gori's question, is the shift to digital collaboration tools means you can actually have an impact in other places around the world without going there. And it is a massive shift. And one of the research quotes I had from somebody I interviewed was that 80% of the value can be delivered remotely. So how can you use digital in all its different forms to maximize social value?
And I think it's been a common theme really throughout, is just to be clear about the social value that you want to create. And it is tricky to unpick. So I think in the world of we're all kind of learning a little bit, it's okay to put up your hands and say you need to understand what you want to create here. I mean, Tideway's key outputs and outcomes is, extremely positive for an asset, a natural asset like the River Thames. And I think that probably the other stuff, the additionality that we wanted to create around it, if we were creating it again, those metrics would be slightly different. So it's just making sure that, on our STEM program, for example, the questions that we ask and the questionnaires are asking the right questions in order to collect the right amount of data to be able to robustly measure that outcome. But I would say that social value as a tool for us has been extremely beneficial and is the one the main third-party verification that we're doing on Tideway's approach to leaving a positive legacy for London.
Nicely put, Samantha. And similar to that, I would give you maybe a little soundbite, which is a robust social valuation is worth more than money for precisely those reasons. Being able to demonstrate the value of what you're doing in the broadest possible sense, but also asking the public, stakeholders, participants what they value is important, because it might not be what you're expecting. And that's what we found with our volunteers. And also in another little study we did about fishing on the canals, we thought it would be all about people catching fish, but it wasn't. It was about being by the water, the calmness, the letting go of all the stress and reducing the anxiety. It was what people really valued. So that's the thought.
I think that was what one of the questions from Beth was. It's like White House and Mortimer, Jenny. Sure, everyone's watching.
Exactly. I was just thinking about them. Yeah.
I was in the middle of replying very detailed one to Gary, and it's completely disappeared. So I'm going to apologise. I've written loads there, and it's just disappeared as I click my microphone. We're doing really well for time, so we're going to wrap up now, 3 minutes early. Just a reminder, really, that you've got the awards at 1 p.m. and then the climate change talk at 3 p.m. Which, thinking of tuning in now, it's stoked up my history of climate change. I'll get quite excited about that in an interesting way. But thanks for being here. I hope that was useful. Please read the Wellbeing Guidance. It's worth it if you're in social value. And I'm going to stop the session now. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, speakers.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.